Hey there! Welcome back to Storytime with me, your host, Jenelle Schmidt. I am reading He Whistles for the Cricket by Gwen Walker, my grandma. My grandma wrote this book. Here's the cover. And for all of you who've been joining me all week, thank you. I hope that this has been enjoyable and that you have been able to just be entertained by it at least, or maybe you're falling in love with a new story, and so I hope everybody's doing well. Today is Friday. For anybody who needs to know, today is Friday. Tomorrow's Saturday, which means nothing, but that's just the world we live in right now. So I will not be reading tomorrow, and I will not be reading on Sunday. We'll pick up again with Chapter 6 next Monday. Same time, same place, right here, 2:30 p.m. Central. And if you miss it, or if you have been missing the first couple of iterations, or you missed today, the video will stay up. You can watch it after the fact, so you don't have to miss out on anything if you don't get here like when it first starts, or if you forget, or you have your time set wrong, or it's nice outside so you're outside playing, which is great. We were just on a walk. I took my kids for a walk around the neighborhood, and we got a little lost actually because the road did not come out where I thought it would, so I'm feeling a little scatterbrained because I was like barely in time. Also, I've got bread cooking in the kitchen, so I'm hoping that I can get the chapter read before that needs to come out. We'll see. So if I have to leave suddenly in the middle of reading, I'm just taking bread out of the oven because this is real life. Quarantine life. #quarantine life. Anyway, so today we're reading Chapter 5, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, and this is probably one of my favorite chapters of the whole book, but I say that about all of them. So, as we recall, Moses is now living at Miriam's house because she's taking care of him for Mrs. Cheney because he was getting a little too rough with their kitten. And yeah, so that's kind of what happened in the last chapter. All right, let's get started. Chapter 5, Blessed Are the Peacemakers. The rebukes of childhood, unsoftened by compassion, were pebbles and stones in Greg's soul. They tumbled about and hit him now and then, or they lay dormant, lodged in the routine of his days. But the day Queenie died, they were fashioned together into a wall, plastered tight by the cement of rejection on both sides. He fortressed himself on the one side from his father's hurled abuse on the other. Suddenly, there was no more abuse, no more hurled words. Greg never talked about that day to Tom or to anyone else. He didn't talk to his dad at all. His dad did not seem to take notice of this. Greg responded to commands, but that was it. It was not that Greg purposed not to speak to his father, it was just that the wall was there. And the relationship, such as it had been, was cut off. Tom was very much aware of it, and was frustrated by his helplessness to change anything. Greg was distant and unreachable. They didn't have the fun they once had, when they stole away from chores to fish or swim on a hot summer day down where the creek widened into the Fox River. Something inside Greg had died, or lay dying. Mrs. Johnson fussed over Greg more than she ever had before. She, like Tom, sensed the remoteness of her firstborn and tried to coax a little bit of life into him by her attention. She cooked his favorite foods a little more often. On a weeknight, she made meatloaf and wild rice, which he loved, but he said nothing until she prodded him for some small recognition. "Is the meatloaf salty enough, Greg?" she asked. He caught the wistfulness in her question and answered, "It's real good, Mom." That was all. But it was enough. Mr. Johnson pushed away from the table and went to the door. Mrs. Johnson's eyes followed him, but she stayed with her sons and filled the kitchen with domestic sounds of dish clatter and running water. It was hard to keep things smooth at home and work a full day, too. She always had the huge milking cans to wash before morning. They were half as tall as she was. Tom was becoming more thoughtful in his growing concern to Greg. His thoughtfulness extended to a new awareness of his mother also. He voluntarily carried the canisters from the lean-to to the kitchen counter for her. "Why, thank you, Tom," she said, surprised. He was embarrassed. yet pleased by her surprise, and he left to begin his evening chores. Greg had pushed away from the table too, but he did not follow his father outside. Unconsciously, he was careful that their paths did not deliberately cross. In a while, he too went outside. He looked across the swell of land toward the Greens' house. That dog sure had grown. Tom had told him she called him Moses. He stood and watched Miriam play with Moses, tossing him a stick. She threw it so pitifully, but he didn't go over to show her how it ought to be done. Tom stood at the barn and watched Greg. There just wasn't much fun left in him, Tom thought. Greg was unaware of Tom's observance. Just then, Moses looked across the yard and ran toward Greg, wagging his tail happily. Miriam followed him, holding in her hand the blunt branch she had been tossing. When she caught up with Moses, she spoke to Greg. "He's a good dog, Greg. Real fast, too." Greg looked at her and registered her acceptance of him. "Could be a lot faster. You gotta toss this stick for him," he said. "Here, let me show you." He took the stick and threw it with the power of his muscled young arm. The branch flew yards away, and Moses flew with it at almost the same speed. "Wow, look at him go!" Tom had been watching, and now he ran over to where the action was. The three of them focused on the young Moses in amazement at his speed. "He's really smart, isn't he?" Miriam said, happy at their joining her. "Nah, any dog knows how to chase a stick," Tom said. "If he was smart, he wouldn't have chewed the bark off that tree of ours." He waited to see Miriam's reaction. She was embarrassed and a little angry at Tom. "Well, you got your tree back, didn't you? Besides, he was just teething," my dad said. "That's not dumb, that's just growing up." She waited to see what Tom would answer, certain that he would. "Yeah, I know," Tom answered in a surprisingly conciliatory way. He was glad for the ease and lightheartedness of this time with the three of them were enjoying Moses together. He was glad for the ease and lightheartedness of this time with the three of them enjoying Moses together. Sorry about that. Greg seemed to have come back to life a little, and Tom wanted the flicker to continue. "What kind of tree was that your dad got us?" he asked. "Same as yours was. A redbud," Miriam told him. "Can't be," Tom answered. "Ours was all pink." He hadn't ever noticed the tree before, until Moses had stripped the bark off, and Miriam and her mom and dad had walked over and told the Johnsons they would get them a new tree. That had happened about 3 weeks ago. Miriam had stayed at Cheney's for extra work, and Moses had been lonely and bored. Now, at 7 months, his teething, which had stopped for a while, had become vigorous again. "He chews everything," Miriam commented. She'd had to fetch one of her loafers from the backyard swing area where Moses had carried it. "You've got to watch that," her dad reminded her. "Might not be your shoe next time, young lady. Mine would make a better meal, but I need them." He smiled, but he meant it, and Miriam had tried to keep Moses from shoes by giving him an old leather purse her mother had thrown away. Moses particularly loved that old purse. It was just fine. But he continued to like everything else just fine, too. That afternoon, 3 weeks past, he had sprawled in the sun between the Johnsons and the Greens waiting for Miriam. A ground mole caught his attention. It disappeared across the lawn, where Moses traced it frantically to the redbud tree in the Johnsons' yard. The tree's dainty pink blossoms made a pretty contrast with the woolly black fur of the gawky youngster beneath its branches. Moses lost the ground mole and settled down to wait for a reappearance. In the wait, he saw a snag of tree bark. He took it gingerly between his sharp white teeth. It felt sinewy and challenging in his inquisitive jaws. He pulled at it just a little. The bark did a surprising thing. It just kept rising along the tree trunk. Moses loved it. He found another snatch of bark and followed it up the trunk of the tree. This was great fun. He soon circumferenced the tree with 1-inch strips of bark which danced in the breeze, where he left them hanging when he heard Miriam's approach. She saw his afternoon's work in dismay. "Moses, did you do that?" she scolded. The tree looked awful, yet funny at the same time. She didn't know it would die, that its bark was its life, but she thought she'd better tell her mother and father right away. Her mother came over to look. "Well, Miriam, that tree is not going to make it." "Moses!" she called to the pup sharply. "Bad dog!" Moses retreated at the rebuke, and Miriam was more concerned about the problem than she was about Moses just then. "What'll we do, Mom?" she asked. "We'll have to replace that tree, Miriam," her mother answered her. "It was such a pretty thing." Before they went home, they knocked at the Johnsons' door and apologized. I just can't tell you how sorry I am, Mrs. Green said to Mrs. Johnson. A tree's such a blessing, but we'll do what we can to make it right. We'll get another tree in that spot for you. Greg was on the porch and he looked over. You mean Moses did that? He almost smiled, and Mrs. Johnson looked at him quickly. I never knew a dog to like the taste of trees, he'd said. Oh, Moses likes everything, Miriam had replied, and then felt a little foolish that she had not seemed properly repentant. Mrs. Johnson had told them not to bother, in a kind, neighborly way. She was a distant sort of woman, Mrs. Green had always thought. But through this trouble she seemed to warm up to the concern which had come about through the loss of her tree. Later that week, Mr. Green had come home with not one, but with 2 sturdy trees. The trunks had been about as big around as Miriam's forearm. Why 2, Dad? She asked. What kind are they, anyway? They didn't look like the one Moses had teethed on. Redbud, like Moses's lunch the other day, he kidded her. The other one is for your mother. She always liked that tree over there, especially in the spring. Miriam hadn't noticed it more than Tom had until this episode, but now she was able to share her recent knowledge with Tom as they stood discussing Moses and trees. This tree's the same kind, only Dad dug it up after its season, she told him. It gets all pink and pretty about the middle of April, and then gets like this about the 2nd week in May. Won't be in blossom again until next year. Mrs. Green had been so thrilled with the tree Mr. Green had brought home for her. The roots had been carefully wrapped in an old grain sack. They had planted both trees that same night. She watered them faithfully, even when there was a good hope of an early summer rain, most nights. She seemed to take a special pride in tending the tree, and Miriam would see her standing at the kitchen window, just enjoying it. She didn't tell all this to Greg and Tom as they tossed the branch for Moses. She didn't like them thinking Moses was dumb, but she knew he wasn't smart like Missy either. Besides, they criticized Moses in a kindly, teasing way. You could always tell the difference. Her father had told her, well-meaning folks never tease you in your weak points, only in your strengths. Greg gave the branch a long toss after Moses had laid it at his feet. He was awaiting its return when Mr. Johnson walked from the barn towards the house. He looked over at the children and caught Greg's eye during a sudden moment of vulnerability. Greg turned and went toward the barn. At that moment, Moses came racing back with the retrieved branch and looked for Greg. Instead, he saw Mr. Johnson, standing near where Greg had been. He took the branch and offered it at Mr. Johnson's feet, modestly. Then he took a step back, awaiting acclamation. Mr. Johnson stood there for an awkward moment. Miriam sensed heavy tension. She could not consciously identify it. It was as though some heaviness had come into the atmosphere. She wanted to bring some word of help, and so she said, Moses likes you, Mr. Johnson. He looked up at her, thoughtful for a moment. You call him Moses? Yes, Miriam answered. Mrs. Cheney says it's because he's come through some waters. Then she was sorry she'd said that, because she didn't want to bring up those days to him. He caught her hesitancy, and so did Tom. Tom wanted to change the subject, and an opportunity was provided. Someone had come up their drive. Someone's here, Dad, he said. They all looked toward the Johnsons. A tall man came up the driveway, leading a horse by the bridle. He worked with Mr. Johnson at the canning factory. It's Bob Olson, Mr. Johnson said, and left, with no further word of explanation. He walked over to Bob, and the children watched for a moment. With Greg gone, the 2 of them seemed to have less to talk about now, and so they continued tossing the stick for a few minutes, and then each returned to their own yards. "'Lo, Bob," Mr. Johnson greeted. "Surprised you came by," Bob Olson replied. "Told you I would. Think you can look at these shoes." His horse had been somewhat lame. Talking at lunch, Mr. Johnson had told him sometimes shoes needed replacing, and that he could do that for him. Bob was here to take him up on the casual offer. "You go on down to the barn with him. I'll be along in a minute," Mr. Johnson told him. He went up to the house for the freshly watered milk cans, which were draining upside down on the lean-to porch. Bob Olson hitched his horse to the fence, which leaned toward the land, and went into the barn. He looked around until he sighted what he'd come in for. He was a tall man, and just above his eye level he found a bottle of liniment set in the rafters. He pulled a red kerchief from his pocket and walked back outside to his horse. At the same time, Mr. Johnson got there. "What are you doing there, Bob?" he asked. Gonna put some liniment on his knee. Maybe that's it. Seems kind of swollen," Bob answered. "That ain't liniment," Mr. Johnson said. "No, it says so on the bottle." Bob looked at the label again to be certain. "Well, it's not. It's cow vaccine." There was a sudden truculence in Mr. Johnson's voice. "Cow vaccine," Bob returned. "Well, that's a good one on me. Only a fool would think there'd be liniment in a liniment bottle, don't you think?" He laughed in a friendly, chiding way, expecting Mr. Johnson to laugh with him. Instead, Mr. Johnson stared at him for a moment, and then, just as quickly, took the liniment bottle and put it into his hip pocket. "Let's see that horse," he said, without reference again to the bottle. This was not the only time Bob Olson had thought Ted Johnson a strange, angry sort of man, but he knew his stuff, and was therefore a man to be cultivated. That same evening, Mrs. Green looked at her tree once again from her kitchen window. Mr. Green came up behind her, and without turning, she said, "You know, Sam, I've always enjoyed the Johnsons' tree so. It's one of the few really pretty things over there." She was not a critical woman. She just spoke the truth simply. She went on, "Seeing theirs gave me pleasure, but having this one of my own is something different. It's been making me think." "What about?" he asked. "Oh, about Moses," she answered, "and Miriam." "You mean about that rascal stripping their tree?" "No, I mean about owning. She couldn't love him more, and I don't believe he could love her more. But there's something special about owning." They stood for a while contemplating the tree. Finally, Mr. Green said, "Let's say we go over to Cheney's." It was agreed. That evening they told Miriam, "Moses is yours now, Miriam. That is, if you want him." They smiled their offer. "Mine? But he belongs to Mrs. Cheney." "We've asked her. It's fine with her. She kind of considered Moses yours anyhow, but we've taken care of his shots and all, and—" "Oh, Mom and Dad!" Miriam ran to them and hugged each of them. This was still her best expression of gratitude, but she was better able now to speak her thanks also. She'd talked to Moses almost constantly when she was with him, and she was able to talk much more easily with Tom and Jeff in her 11th summer. "It'll be so special having him really my own. I'll pay for his care when he needs it." She'd saved her Mrs. Cheney money pretty faithfully and had the confidence of youth in her financial capabilities. "Better not feed him on any more trees, then," Mr. Green teased. "Or at least feed him the free ones down by the creek." She went outside to be with her first dog, who was her very own. Together they walked to the swing in the backyard. Somehow it seemed fitting. Miriam sat in the swing and faced the creek. The slaughterhouse where she had first met Moses and Queenie and the pups was in eyesight. She got off the swing and walked towards the spot. Bittersweet memories washed over her once again. Moses darted here and there, circling her as they walked. When she was quite close to the shed, she saw Greg with his back up against the partially opened door, tossing pebbles into the creek. "Hi, Greg," she said. He looked up at her and Moses. A wash of awful nostalgia for other times like this, throwing stones for Queenie, hit him. "For a moment I thought that was Queenie," he said. Just a short time ago she had been on the hill with Greg and Tom, playing with Moses, and it had seemed as though it was possible to have a time of lightheartedness once again, a childhood time. For just this moment, Miriam felt very much closer to Greg than she ever had, as though she could touch his feelings. Somehow she felt older, and she didn't find it necessary to withdraw, as though she had intruded upon something which was not quite hers to know. Moses wagged his way to Greg and pushed his nose into Greg's hand, which was halfway into his pocket, as he sat there, leaning against the shed. Miriam thought of how Queenie had done that with her so often, and she felt a hungry, yearning feeling which she could not identify. "He likes you, Greg," Miriam spoke softly. She said to Greg what she had said to his father a while earlier. Greg looked at her. He suddenly had found an audience for the feelings which had pressed in on him for so long. "Can't think why," he answered bitterly. "Must like dog killers." "Oh, Greg, you're not!" The awfulness of the admission overwhelmed her, and she denied it for him. "Am too!" His eyes, too old for this admission before the little girl next door, brimmed suddenly with a rage of hot tears. "It's just what I am." He got up and left, in fury at himself for exposing his vulnerability, and at her for seeing it. "Greg," she called after him, helpless. "You're not. You're—" She stood, with the words dangling, as he moved so quickly away. All the while the creek waters pushed against a green twig cross whose vertical branch had rooted to the creek bank. Miriam did instinctively what she never could have brought herself to do if she had taken the time to reflect. If she had returned to her swing and pondered her new position as owner of the dog who loved her and followed her, who lay at the foot of her bed and waited for her on the long school days and chewed trees in the loneliness of wanting her presence and voice and caress. Moses followed her now as she made the long walk up the hill across the Johnsons' farmyard and found Mr. Johnson still in the barn. He was alone, as she had prayed he would be. Though her decision had come to her very suddenly, it seemed to her as though it had been in her heart for a long while, and that this was far more than an impulse. The pain that she had known to be in Greg pressed in upon her so intensely down at the creek, and she felt she could not bear letting him go on like that, if she had the ability to help. She said to Mr. Johnson what she had come to say, and she meant it with her whole heart. The cost of her sacrifice was great, but it had been paid down at the creek in a moment of solemn, painful resolution. "Mr. Johnson, I want Greg to have Moses," she said. "Would you give him?" Her voice broke, and she hadn't wanted it to, but she'd said what she wanted to. She couldn't quite finish. She couldn't say, "He thinks he's a dog killer." The words stuck in her throat, and so she just stood there, hoping this gift, more precious than anything she owned, could heal Greg. Mr. Johnson looked at her with an awareness of the extent of her offer. His hand went to the liniment bottle in his pocket for a moment. He remembered his dad, so long in the past, and another kind of bottle which had worked such devastation on his family. Since Bob Olson had left, he could not get away from the implication of his words. Only a fool would think there's liniment in a liniment bottle. He could not escape the memory of the helpless inadequacy he'd grown up with in the presence of his own father, and the anger and the silent years which were now beyond repair. "Little girl," he said, drawn back to the present by her waiting there so helplessly. "You just take your pup and run on home with him." He said it gently, touching her shoulder in a clumsy gesture of gratitude. He did not avert his eyes from her as she'd seen him do with others so many times in the past. He became real. Moses pushed his nose up to Mr. Johnson and tried to take the liniment bottle from his grasp. Mr. Johnson said, almost in relief, "Sure is a fine pup. A lot like Queenie, seems to me." Miriam didn't quite know what to say exactly, so she said, "Queenie was Greg's dog," as though Mr. Johnson didn't know that, "and so I thought maybe he'd like her pup." Moses had been offered up, but refused, and now she was not able to sort all the emotions she was experiencing. Mr. Johnson continued looking at her and talking. "Nah, that's your pup for sure. You two are a sort of a pair. What Greg needs, little girl, isn't a dog. It's a dad." Mr. Johnson found Greg in his room late that night. "Greg," he began. Greg had not been sleeping. He looked up, walled and sullen. He didn't say anything. Like Moses offering the branch. Like Miriam offering up all that she had. With unpracticed humility, Mr. Johnson made an offering of himself. "Greg, your old man's the dumb fool, not you. Not you." It was the only way he knew. The Lord understood the Father's inadequacy and was able to impart what was necessary to the Son. With his help, Mr. Johnson had made a chink in the wall. A fortress began to crumble, and Greg met him on the other side. A prodigal father had found his way home. So just a reminder. Oh man, that's just beautiful. Everything about this book is beautiful, and I cry in all the same places every single time. So it's not really surprising. Anyway, just a reminder, I won't be reading tomorrow or Sunday. I'm going to take the weekend off, and I will see you back here, or you will see me back here, on Monday at 2:30 Central, and we'll continue with Chapter 6. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it.